Greg, welcome to Property Nomads. I've been really looking forward to this actually since we started emailing back and forth a little while ago, because of what we're going to talk about, and to the listeners as well, there's a special offer at the end. So check out the end of the podcast as well. Landlords, solar panels, all this technology and things that are moving forwards. But before we sort of dive into that, could you just give a little bit of background about yourself as an individual, what we're doing before what you were doing now?
Sure. Yeah. Firstly, thank you for having me. I've been looking forward to this too. This is really quite exciting. So I'm Greg. I'm head of product and customer experience. I've got kind of a couple of roles within the business. First, on the product side, is to make sure that we really understand our customer problems and ultimately design and deliver a solution that actually solves those problems for them. So it creates that value. On the customer experience side, I work with our CX team to deliver what we call the effortless experience. So if there's a problem, a question, we solve that problem or deliver the answer with as little perceived effort as possible. So we try to make it really nice and easy to work with us. The reason I think those two work really well together is that both require listening to customers. So if there's a problem or a question, that's really useful. How do we solve that? But also, how can I take that into the product world and say, well, how can we prevent that question from coming up in the first place? So that's kind of my role within the business. I've been with the company for about 3.5 years now. And seen it through various different evolutions and iterations. But before Make My House Green, I've had quite a varied career. So I started with a degree in engineering, did a master's in renewable energy because I wanted to save the world. And then I went into consulting. So I spent a few years as an operational consultant, working with large scale organizations from kind of how to deliver a service across a larger cohort of users, so service users if it's kind of a government-based service delivery model, or build something, so large scale manufacturing programs, how do we reduce the cost base or deliver that project in a shorter amount of time. So some really huge projects, really interesting problems to solve. And one of the things I loved about it was that working at pace, which is great, solving interesting problems. But we never did anything in the sustainability or environment space. So I then moved into central government, and I worked for the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy for a couple of years as a policy manager, working on what I would call the biggest emissions reduction policy that nobody's heard of, which is the emissions trading system. So it's a huge scheme that helps reduce emissions across the largest emitters in the UK. So industrial emitters, chemicals, that kind of thing. But what it kind of gave me in terms of environmental and sustainability, big box ticked, it didn't give me in terms of working at pace. So being kind of within government, I found it wasn't necessarily the environment for me. It is for others. Some people love being kind of at the heart of decision making and a seat of power, but I think I found I preferred to be on the front lines. So my next step after Bays was to join Make My House Green, essentially to get back on that front line. And now I feel like I've got the best of both worlds. So I am able to work at pace on the front line, delivering something that I'm really passionate and believe strongly in.
Fantastic. I'm sure there's going to be people listening to that would not associate government and fast paced with anything. To be perfectly honest, that's no good. I'm glad sort of you're in a position where you're thriving because it meets your needs basically, which is good. Just for caveat purposes, before we crack on with solar panels and whatnot, I will say that I do some surveying for Make My House Green. So for people that regular listeners to the show, there is some association here. This interview is not just plucked out of the middle of nowhere, because there is a working relationship there as well. So solar panels becoming quite prevalent at the moment, mainly really, well, people that want to be more environmentally friendly, etc., but also with changes to energy performance certificate regulations. I know from experience of producing the certificates myself that if you plop some solar panels on, your rating 9 times out of 10 is going to be substantially higher. So that's one benefit. And from the surveying I've done, it's for homeowners, people that are looking to become more self-sufficient, etc. But we're here to talk about something that's a win-win for landlords and tenants. And this is sort of the section where I'll just ask a leading question, Greg, because the floor's going to be all yours. So Make My House Green have been working on a few things in the background, a couple of schemes that are going to really help both sets of parties. I don't really know where to start, but tell us
Sure.
what you can. Yeah, tell us what you can and how it can benefit people.
Yeah, I'd be delighted to. I think partly because any of my colleagues that are listening so far, all I've spoken about is me, which will be hilarious. So what I'll do is I'll just talk a little bit about Make My House Green, what we do in general, what we've been up to, and then I'll kind of steer it towards the space that we've been playing in, the stuff that we've been testing for landlords specifically, because I think that'll be the stuff that's interesting, but it has to be based on that initial context. So Make My House Green, to start with, is a platform that helps people work out what green home solutions are right for them. So with a few questions, a few bits of information, we can present you with the data that says, here's how many panels you can fit on your roof, here's how much that might cost, and here's how much you can save, both on your energy bills and in terms of your carbon footprint. And all of that is freely accessible, free to use for everybody. Quick plug, makemyhousegreen.com is where they can do that. Just answer a few questions, go through that funnel. Once you've done that, if you like what you see and you think actually those numbers work for me, you can then work with one of our experts to more accurately design a system. So you can get something that actually fits for your house. You can get an expert to do that for you. And then ultimately we work with you to get that installed. So we're essentially the partner from kind of initial questions of should I get solar to great, I've got solar, what's next? So that's kind of what we've been doing for the last few years. Along that journey, we've had the privilege of working with a few key partners, so investors and partners like Nationwide Building Society. So it's fantastic to have their backing both in us as a business, so they've invested in us, as well as kind of a recommendation to their member base. The reason I mention that is that I think it's important for customers when they're looking for a partner. Who am I going to choose to get on my roof to install these panels and to deliver this? What essentially is a long-term investment. It really adds value for them to be able to say, actually, I'm going to choose a company that I know I can trust. And Nationwide is a really nice marker for that. They've done their due diligence in us, and part of our working with them means that we have to continue to do due diligence in all the installation teams that we work with, as well as all the kit that we use. So throughout the process, it just means that we're kind of looking to make sure that we deliver and use quality stuff. We then move into the landlord space. We say, great, we've been helping homeowners, owner occupiers deliver those savings, get those carbon reductions, those bill reductions across their properties. How can we help others? Landlords is a group, is one that we're interested in. I'm a landlord myself. And so we're kind of looking to understand how we can help them, as well as help their tenants. To be honest, we actually started looking at a proposition, which is where we could install panels and then add a meter that would allow the landlord to then bill the tenant for direct use of the energy that comes from the solar panels. When we tested that, we actually found that it would be a bit more expensive to offer. It would require an ongoing service fee because essentially we'd end up having to become a regulated supplier. And actually for kind of the payback, it didn't really make sense. So through working with a small group of landlords who we've been testing this with, we actually found that it's much simpler to say, when we put those panels on that property, we can estimate that it's going to save you roughly £600 a year. And so what you can do is actually just add £50 a month to your rental agreement with your tenant. They then see that reduction on their energy bill. So their net position as a tenant is exactly the same. They're just paying a little bit extra to the landlord and a little bit less to the energy company. As a landlord, that also gives you flexibility. So if you want to say, actually, I'm only going to add 40 on, that's fine. You can add 40 on. And then the final point is that landlords can then sell the excess energy because they own the property and the solar panels. Any energy that the tenant doesn't use, you can plug straight back into the grid and sell. And if you rewind kind of a year, 18 months, the rate that you could sell that for was about 5p a kilowatt hour, which is ridiculous when you were buying it for 33. But now we're seeing tariffs come onto the market. So there are a couple that are available where you can earn between 15 and 17p per kilowatt hour. So it's becoming much more exciting, much more profitable to sell that excess back to the grid. The only other thing I would say is that from an owner-occupied domestic install perspective, we find that lots of people get value from batteries, but that's where they're able to kind of generate excess during the day, store it, and then use it themselves in the evening. That may or may not be the case with landlords. And so what we tend to do is kind of work with them to understand what the usage type for their property might be. But because it can be variable, you've got a tenant in there this year, you might have a different tenant in there in 6 months' time who has a very different usage profile. the calculations that we run to say, yeah, battery would make sense for you now, might not be true in 6 months. So what we tend to find is that we kind of advise a bit of caution on the battery side. If you're adamant that you want to maximize the energy efficiency and the green credentials of your property because you think that'll attract a really good tenant or give you choice of tenants, then sure, go for it. A battery will make sense. But from the perspective of our job, helping you find and install the right thing for you, that's kind of a question mark. Solar panels definitely do make sense, but battery is a question mark for landlords at this point.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I know from surveying experience, I have never, to my knowledge, when I've gone around surveying for Make My House Green, I've never dealt with a landlord. It's always been owner occupiers. You know, my advice is very generic. Ultimately, it's up to you. You're the one that owns the home. You know, you have to do what works for you. But I've always said to people to potentially look at the battery purely because the cost of sending back to the grid is pittance. Now, from the information you've just said, actually, it sounds like things are starting to get a bit better. So that's a win-win. But going back to the landlord side, one question that springs to mind, and hopefully this doesn't catch you off guard, because I've just thought of it, is people might be listening to this making an assumption of having your tenant in the home, and we're talking domestic dwellings. Is there anything in the commercial space, or is it just the same principle? Do you have anything lined up for people that might be listening, commercial landlords?
The short answer is maybe. So we're always exploring. I think our expertise, our experience lies in the owner-occupied domestic space. The landlord space is something that we're kind of working with, but on a smaller scale. At the moment, the plus for that is that we're working very closely with the landlords that we are working with. So they're giving us feedback, what's working, what's not. On the commercial side, we are exploring things, but we're not kind of aggressively pursuing that. So for clarity, that means office spaces where there's a huge amount of roof space, and you might want to then plug the free energy into that office building, or even flats where you want to say, actually, we've got some communal energy that gets used for lighting or hallways or whatever, or even assisted living locations. So somewhere where actually part of the resident's fee for living there includes bills. And so as a landlord for that type of property, plugging in this free energy actually makes a bit more sense. And that's certainly a place that we're interested in. As I say, it's not something we're aggressively pursuing. But as part of our testing, it might be that that's one of the areas where we can add the most value, and landlords of that type of property can see the most benefit. So yeah, very open to that.
Watch this space effectively.
Essentially, yes.
It's that's the case. So we discussed the benefits there to parties involved, and I'm just trying to think of, like you said, you're a landlord as well. I'm a landlord. We're trying to get into a landlord's head.
Yeah.
Let's just say landlords listen to this and they go, yeah, actually, I quite like the sound of this. I like the idea. I want to get in contact and see how the process works. Are you able to run through the process for me? So let's just say I'm a landlord. I'm listening to this podcast. Oh, Make My House Green. Okay, I'll click on the website. What would happen next in an ideal world?
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. So I think we're going to put a link in the show notes. Is that right?
Correct. Links in all the links in the show notes. Yeah.
Great. So start there. You'll land on the website. There's essentially a quick form that will ask you a few questions. Answer those about your tenanted property, not your own, unless of course you want to assess your own as well. But you'll go through. There are, just for clarity, the questions in there are location. So where's the property? We need that because we essentially need to understand the roof space that we've got available, as well as map the weather data. So how much sun do we expect to see on that property? There are also things like number of occupants and your average expected energy bill. In that initial flow, that's just a simple range of expected value. So it's not, I need the pounds and pence figure of what's the energy bill, because I appreciate for landlords, they might not know that for the tenant. But there are ranges that you can select. Again, there's an energy profile. So how do we use energy? There are two really common energy profiles, and you can see those in there. So there are things like, where do I use most of my energy? Do I see nothing throughout the day and then big evening peak when everybody returns home from work? Do I use more in the evening? Or do I perhaps use more throughout the day? Is it a fairly steady use of energy? And you can take a fairly good stab at this if you know that all of your tenants work during the day and they work away from the home, then you're going to see it be quite low there, and then they return. So you're going to see that spike in the evening. If they both work from home, let's say you've got 2 tenants, then actually you're going to see a steadier use throughout the day. So you can take a good guess at that. And this is all to help us model the expected savings that you might see from that property. So once you've answered those questions, you'll land on essentially what's called our roof selector. So based on the address that you popped in, you'll be then able to outline your roof. We can then calculate how much space we've got and therefore how many panels you might be able to fit. They'll also ask you what direction it faces, so southeast, northwest, etc. And then after that, you land on the model. So this has a little graph on the left and then some selectors on the right. So this is a real opportunity to have a play. So this is where you get the figures about how much it's going to cost, how much you're going to save. And then you can tweak loads of things. So you can say, well, what happens if I get 2 more panels? What does that do to my return on investment? What happens if I get a battery? What happens if I increase the size of the battery? And probably more for owner occupiers, there are other things like what happens if I plug in an electric vehicle or get something called an immersion diverter, which diverts excess electricity into your hot water tank. So it says, instead of selling it back to the grid, or if I can't store it in a battery, just throw that into the hot water tank and save that for later. So there are little options like that that you can have a play with. Again, possibly more interesting for owner occupiers, but that's all possible in there. And all the time, any change you can make, you can see how much it's going to cost and how much it's going to save. If they like what they see, there's a big button at the bottom that says click get detailed quotes, big green button, and then you just choose a time and book a call with one of our experts. The process from there is essentially to understand more about you. So you get connected with one of our gurus. We'll understand your goals, what you're trying to achieve. We'll then design with you, as I said earlier, a few options that might work for you given your criteria. We'll then start with a remote survey, which is just kind of gathering more photos, doing a video call to look at specific things in the property. So we're kind of checking for a few things like, how do we get access to the roof? Is the ground nice and flat and stable outside? Can we get scaffolding? Should we use a tower? And other things like, what's the state of your consumer unit and the fuse board? So is there a slot in there that we can plug the solar panels in, or do we need to bring an extension or an additional box? So those are the sorts of things that we'll do in the remote survey. It's nothing too technical, and the gurus will guide you through that process. And then ultimately, if you like what you're seeing, you think one of those options can work for you, we then pay a deposit, and we just choose a date. And at the moment, typical lead times from kind of paying a deposit to getting panels on roof is between 3 and 6 weeks. So thankfully, DNOs, the district network operators, the guys that manage the grid, or the kind of the locations of the grid across the country, have improved the pace at which they can kind of operate and allow people to do these sorts of things. So there was a bit of a blocker last year, so it slowed a few companies down, but thankfully it's much quicker at the moment. So as I say, 3 to 6 weeks from deposit to install, which is really exciting.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that time frame. I'm probably going to ask you that off air, to be fair. Given experiences I've had speaking to people last year, that's good. So actually, from getting it from A to B, it's relatively seamless, and I can say that from Vinish and from speaking with customers as well. That right. It's relatively seamless. Works like clockwork, and the lead times from what you've just said have drastically improved. So that's really good. I'm just trying to think out loud here. So in my head, what I've got is, if you're a landlord, that the benefits you're going to get from this is that from an aesthetics point of view, your property might look better. Some properties do look better with your solar panels on, which is good. The odds of your energy performance rating increasing are very high. I'm not the energy performance software, so I never like to guarantee that it's going to go up, but the odds are that your energy certificate rating is going to go higher, which again is great because that solves all those regulation bits and bobs. And also you could then possibly charge the tenants more rent, which from an accounting point of view is going to look better when you do your accounts at the end of each year. So to me, they're the 3 wins that I can think of. Am I missing anything, Greg, from a landlord?
I think the property value can also increase. So depending on the location, and I will say that it depends. In some areas, adding solar panels does not, or there's no evidence yet to suggest that it does add value. But in others, there is evidence to suggest that it does. So essentially, you can command a premium for the resale value. So if you're in an area where prospective buyers would value solar panels, then you can command that premium and see that property value increase. If you're not, then you can't. And the reason I'm being a bit vague is because it's so location dependent. The best point of knowledge for this is probably estate agents. So talk to estate agents in your area or the area that you're interested in to understand whether you would be able to get the premium for the panels. But there can be quite a good upside to that. The other side of this is that when you do sell, the solar panel installation is classified as a capital expenditure, which you can then deduct. So it's tax deductible. So this upfront cost actually is tax deductible, which is another advantage if you're looking to resell. But I appreciate many landlords are in it for the long haul, and so resale might not be a thing that interests them. I think those are the key things. We have also seen some landlords say that because they've got panels on the property, they're able to get more tenants apply. So if they're looking to fill a property where it's become or about to become vacant, because it's got that green credential really quite visibly, it becomes a more attractive proposition to some tenants. And they say, yeah, I'm going to choose this over that, because people are becoming more and more conscious of their carbon footprint. And so this kind of is a double whammy. If they can say their energy bills are going to be lower, because they will be, and they're using a large proportion of their energy like coming from a green source, two big boxes ticked. And being a landlord myself, I know the value of being able to choose from a selection of tenants. If I'm in a position where it's like, I want to avoid a void, sometimes you can rush into a decision. And having more options, from my experience at the very least, is better in terms of tenants. And this gives you that.
I think they're the worst tax deductible. I think have pricked the ears up of a lot of people. To be honest with you, listening to that. Yeah, I mean that all sounds fantastic. I mean, I'm not able to think of any other questions that would be suitable for this discussion. So let's just recap what we've gone through. So we have gone through the fact that in the last couple of years, Make My House Green have been predominantly looking at owner occupiers. We're now moving into the landlord. Sorry, I'm afraid it sounds like I work for the company. Make My House Green are now going into the landlord tenant area at the moment, predominantly residential. Watch this space for commercial and other forms of property moving forwards.
Yeah.
And in order to get a quote and to see what's possible, you head to the website, links in the show notes. Head to the website. You can have a play around a little bit with the software tools. The gurus are on hand to help you. And again, I can say that from experience, they definitely do help. They're absolutely fantastic. And then you can work with the team. And you're saying to me that the lead time at the moment, at the time of recording this, is anywhere between 3 to 6 weeks, because the DNOs, the network operators, have cleaned their game up for want of a better way. So to me, that all sounds relatively straightforward, Greg.
Perfect. Cool. I think you've summarized it really accurately. I think the only other thing to say is that I'm really passionate about this. Like, it was the reason I chose to work for Make My House Green. It's something that I think is necessary, valuable, and I'm really proud to work for the business. And I think I'm really glad to hear from your perspective that your engagement with the gurus and the rest of the ops team has been similar. I think if there's a landlord out there that says, I'd be curious to see if this works financially, if the answer is yes, that's fantastic, because there's also the additional benefit of putting more clean green electrons on the grid. So the more that we can do that, and I don't want to kind of get on my high horse or soapbox here, but I think like we're in a position where this is absolutely necessary, and I'm really pleased that we can make that necessary shift in a financially viable way. I think it's fantastic that the market, the shape of it, has come to the point where that's absolutely possible.
Yeah, and that's good to hear. It's good to have people that are passionate and inspired to do what they do. So it's always good to hear, but people like yourself, Greg, no matter what it is we believe in or whatever, the fact that you've got the passion, you're inspired to do this, and you can tell from listening to you that that fire, dare I say, is inside you. We mentioned at the start the special offer for people listening to the podcast. We might as well get around to that, because people are probably sat on their hands thinking, tell me what it is, tell me what it is. So yeah, we've got a little special offer for listeners listening to this on podcast or YouTube.
Essentially what we'd love to do is anybody that uses the link in the show notes to come through the website will get £100 discount. So all they need to do is use that link and it will be applied. If you don't see it applied in the model, there'll be a nice big green banner that says you've got £100 discount. If you don't see that, just let us know as you go through the process, and we should be able to apply that. All you need to reference is this podcast, this conversation, and we can do that. It's not a problem at all. But if you use the link, that should be in there.
Perfect. And as we said at the start, we will put the links into the show notes. If you're watching this on YouTube, they'll be in the description below us, which is great. And yet, just reference Property Nomads, and the team will deal with everything. Greg, I've got nothing else in mind. That all sounds fantastic. So I would urge people to at least explore and have a play around with it and see what can be done. Even if you look at this from an owner-occupier point of view, definitely worth having a play around on the website. Apart from the offer, is there anything else to add? Any final words before we wrap up?
No, I think from my perspective, thank you. I think this is really, really interesting conversation, really useful to kind of share lots of this. I think the only other thing to say is at the start, I mentioned that we kind of test and iterate. I love feedback. We love feedback. Like, it's the only way that we can grow and improve this offering. So even if somebody uses the model, uses the website and says, actually, it's not for me, or this isn't quite right for me, I'd love to know why. So please do drop us an email. Again, if I could share an email with you, Rob, that would be fantastic. Like I'm all ears. So any way that we can make this work for more people, whether that's the platform, the process, or the ultimate product that people buy, again, I'm very grateful for any feedback that people are willing to share.
Yeah, perfect. And if there is a contact email address there, again, just look in the show notes. All the information will be in the show notes for you. Well, Greg, no, superb. It's been absolutely fantastic. Superb. Thanks for the information. I'm sure people can get a lot from this as well. And maybe when the testing of the commercial stuff, basically, let's grab an interview again at some point. If there's any development on that side, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. That'd be great.
Well, thank you very much. See you soon.
Excellent. Thanks, Rob.